Rebecca Martinez had always been fascinated by aviation, but she never imagined she'd be standing in the middle of a restricted airspace controversy that would change her life forever. As a documentary filmmaker specializing in military stories, she had spent 3 years working on a project about forgotten heroes of the Iraq War. Her latest assignment brought her to the remote desert of Nevada, where she hoped to capture footage of a memorial site that had been largely overlooked by mainstream media. The memorial was dedicated to Captain James Morrison, a young F-22 pilot who had died in a training accident 5 years earlier. What made this site special wasn't just the monument itself, but the personal artifacts left behind by his family and fellow servicemen. Among these was a carefully preserved American flag that had been torn during Captain Morrison's final mission, a flag that his squadron had kept as a symbol of his sacrifice and dedication to service. Rebecca had obtained all the necessary permits and clearances for her documentary work, or so she thought. She had been filming at the memorial for 2 days when everything went wrong. As she was setting up her equipment to capture the morning light hitting the memorial, she heard the distinctive roar of jet engines approaching from the horizon. Within minutes, two F-22 Raptors appeared in the sky above her, circling her position with an intensity that made her stomach drop. Through her camera lens, she watched as the aircraft maintained their patrol pattern, clearly monitoring her every move. The situation escalated quickly when a convoy of military vehicles arrived at the memorial site, led by Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander who had initially denied Rebecca's permit application. Colonel Hayes had a reputation for being inflexible and territorial about her jurisdiction, and she had made it clear from their first meeting that she didn't appreciate civilians poking around military installations, even with proper documentation. Miss Martinez, you're in violation of restricted airspace regulations, Colonel Hayes announced as she stepped out of her vehicle, flanked by two security personnel. You need to pack up your equipment immediately and leave the premises. Rebecca tried to explain that she had obtained clearance through the proper channels, but Colonel Hayes dismissed her protests with a wave of her hand. Your permits are invalid. This area has been reclassified as a no-fly zone for civilian aircraft and unauthorized personnel. The confrontation intensified when Rebecca refused to leave without understanding why her previously approved permits had suddenly become invalid. She had invested significant time and resources into this project, and more importantly, she had made a promise to Captain Morrison's family that she would tell his story. The torn flag that flew at the memorial had become a central symbol in her documentary, representing not just one man's sacrifice, but the broader narrative of service members who had given everything for their country. Colonel Hayes ordered her security team to confiscate Rebecca's equipment and escort her off the premises. As they began loading her cameras and recording devices into their vehicles, Rebecca felt a crushing sense of injustice. She had followed every rule, obtained every permit, and worked within the system, yet she was being treated like a criminal. The two F-22s continued their overhead surveillance, a constant reminder of the power imbalance she faced. Rebecca Martinez stared at the confiscated equipment being loaded into military vehicles, her 3 years of work disappearing before her eyes. The documentary about Captain Morrison's sacrifice, the story his family had trusted her to tell, was being stripped away by bureaucratic power plays that made no sense. Colonel Hayes stood with her arms crossed, a satisfied expression on her face as she watched her security team work efficiently to clear the memorial site. "This is completely unreasonable," Rebecca said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "I have documented proof of my permits. I spoke with your office last month and everything was approved." Colonel Hayes barely glanced at the paperwork Rebecca held out. "Regulations change, Miss Martinez. National security takes precedence over your little film project. You should have confirmed your status before coming out here." The injustice of the situation burned in Rebecca's chest. She had spent months coordinating with various military departments, filing the proper applications, and ensuring she had every authorization needed. The memorial site wasn't even classified as highly sensitive. It was a place where family members regularly came to pay their respects. Yet Colonel Hayes was treating it like a top-secret installation, using her authority to crush a project that honored a fallen hero. As the security team finished loading her equipment, Rebecca noticed one of the F-22 pilots had landed at a nearby airstrip. He was walking toward the memorial, his flight suit bearing the distinctive patches of the 422nd Test and Evaluation Squadron. Something about his purposeful stride and the way he carried himself suggested this wasn't just a routine security check. He approached the memorial with a reverence that caught Rebecca's attention, and she watched as he knelt beside the torn flag that had become the centerpiece of her documentary. The pilot remained at the memorial for several minutes, his head bowed in what appeared to be private prayer or reflection. When he finally stood and walked toward the group, Rebecca could see his face clearly for the first time. He was older than she had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the weathered features of someone who had spent years in high-stress situations. His name tag read Major Anderson, and his expression was serious as he approached Colonel Hayes. "Colonel, I need to speak with you about this situation," Major Anderson said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of combat experience. Colonel Hayes looked surprised by the interruption, clearly not expecting one of her pilots to involve himself in what she considered a simple security matter. "This is just a routine clearance issue, Major. Nothing that concerns flight operations." Major Anderson glanced toward Rebecca, then back at the memorial where the torn flag continued to flutter in the desert breeze. With all due respect, Colonel, I think there might be more to this than a simple permit problem. That flag over there, I recognize it. It's from Captain Morrison's final mission, and I was his wingman on that flight. The revelation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, and Rebecca felt her heart race as she realized the significance of what she was hearing. Colonel Hayes's confident demeanor wavered slightly as Major Anderson continued speaking. Captain Morrison was carrying that flag when our formation encountered severe weather over the Nevada test range. We got separated in the storm, and by the time I found him, his aircraft had already gone down. That flag was recovered from the wreckage, torn but intact, and it's been here ever since as a reminder of his sacrifice. Major Anderson's voice carried a weight that made everyone present stop and listen. He had been there on that final mission, witnessed the events that led to Captain Morrison's death, and carried the survivor's guilt that came with losing a wingman. As he spoke, Rebecca realized that this wasn't just about her documentary anymore. It was about honoring the memory of a fallen comrade and ensuring that his story wouldn't be buried by bureaucratic interference. I've been flying over this memorial for 5 years, Major Anderson continued, his eyes fixed on Colonel Hayes. Every training mission, every test flight, I make sure to pass over this site as a tribute to Jim Morrison. When I saw you were shutting down someone who was trying to tell his story, I had to land and find out what was happening. His words carried an implicit challenge to Colonel Hayes's authority, and Rebecca could see the tension building between them. Colonel Hayes found herself in an increasingly difficult position. She had acted swiftly to shut down Rebecca's documentary project, confident in her authority, and convinced that she was protecting sensitive military interests. But Major Anderson's intervention had introduced a complication she hadn't anticipated. As a squadron commander, she couldn't simply dismiss the concerns of one of her most experienced pilots, especially when those concerns involved honoring a fallen airman. Major, I understand your connection to Captain Morrison, Colonel Hayes said carefully, but we have protocols to follow. Civilian access to military installations must be strictly controlled, regardless of the subject matter. Major Anderson nodded respectfully, but his expression remained resolute. I agree about protocols, Colonel, but I also believe that when someone is working to honor our fallen comrades, we should be finding ways to help them, not shutting them down. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, this one carrying Captain Morrison's father, retired Master Sergeant William Morrison. He had been visiting the memorial monthly since his son's death, and he recognized Rebecca from their previous conversations about the documentary. His presence added another layer of complexity to the situation, as Colonel Hayes now faced not just a determined filmmaker and a concerned pilot, but also the family member of the fallen airman she was supposedly protecting. "What's going on here?" Master Sergeant Morrison asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years in the military. "Rebecca, why are they taking your equipment?" As Rebecca explained the situation, she could see the anger building in the older man's eyes. He had given his blessing to the documentary project, believing it would help preserve his son's legacy and honor his sacrifice. Now he was watching as military bureaucracy threatened to silence that story. Major Anderson found himself caught between his loyalty to the chain of command and his commitment to honoring Captain Morrison's memory. He had flown with Jim Morrison, trained with him, and considered him both a skilled pilot and a close friend. The idea that bureaucratic obstacles were preventing the world from learning about Jim's dedication and sacrifice felt like a betrayal of everything they had fought for together. "Colonel Hayes," Master Sergeant Morrison said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "my son died serving his country. This young lady is trying to make sure people remember what he stood for and why he made the ultimate sacrifice. I can't understand why you would want to stop that." His words carried the weight of a father's grief and the authority of a man who had dedicated his life to military service. The situation was becoming increasingly complex for Colonel Hayes. What had started as a straightforward enforcement of regulations was now involving multiple stakeholders, each with legitimate concerns and emotional investments in the outcome. She found herself questioning whether her initial reaction had been appropriate, but her pride and concern about setting precedents made it difficult for her to back down. Major Anderson stepped forward, his flight suit still bearing the dust from his quick landing. "Colonel, I have a proposal. What if we could find a way to support this documentary project while still maintaining appropriate security protocols? Captain Morrison's story deserves to be told, and his family has given their blessing to the project." His suggestion offered a potential path forward, but it would require Colonel Hayes to admit that her initial response had been too harsh. Rebecca watched the exchange with growing hope. She had been prepared to fight this battle alone, but now she had unexpected allies in Major Anderson and Master Sergeant Morrison. The torn flag continued to flutter in the desert breeze, a silent reminder of the sacrifice that had brought them all together. She realized that this confrontation was becoming bigger than just her documentary. It was about how the military honored its fallen heroes, and whether bureaucratic concerns would take precedence over preserving their stories. The tension in the group was palpable as everyone waited for Colonel Hayes's response. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, the determined filmmaker, the concerned pilot, the grieving father, and her own security team who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. The memorial site, which had been a place of quiet reflection, had become the center of a conflict that would determine not just the fate of Rebecca's documentary, but how the military would handle similar situations in the future. Colonel Hayes felt the weight of multiple pressures converging on her decision. Her training emphasized the importance of following protocols and maintaining security, but she also recognized that she was dealing with people who genuinely cared about honoring military service. The presence of Master Sergeant Morrison particularly complicated matters, as his status as a military family member and his obvious support for the documentary project made her position increasingly difficult to defend. "I need to make some phone calls," Colonel Hayes finally said, her voice betraying the uncertainty she felt. "This situation has become more complex than I initially realized, and I want to ensure we're handling it appropriately." It was a small concession, but it represented the first crack in her rigid stance. Major Anderson nodded approvingly, while Rebecca felt a glimmer of hope that her project might still be salvaged. As Colonel Hayes walked away to make her calls, Major Anderson approached Rebecca with a thoughtful expression. "I want you to know that what you're doing matters," he said quietly. "Jim Morrison was one of the best pilots I've ever flown with, and more importantly, he was a good man. His story deserves to be told, and his family deserves to have his sacrifice recognized." His words provided Rebecca with the encouragement she needed to continue fighting for her project. Master Sergeant Morrison stood beside his son's memorial, his weathered hands touching the torn flag that had become so central to Rebecca's documentary. "This flag was on Jim's aircraft during his final mission," he told Rebecca, his voice filled with both pride and sorrow. "It represents everything he believed in: service, sacrifice, and commitment to protecting others. I want the world to know what kind of man he was, and that's why I supported your project from the beginning." The emotional weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was a father who had lost his son in service to his country, a pilot who had lost his wingman and friend, and a filmmaker who had dedicated years of her life to preserving their story. The bureaucratic obstacles that had seemed so important to Colonel Hayes suddenly appeared petty in comparison to the genuine human connections and shared commitment to honoring military service. Rebecca found herself thinking about all the other military families who had similar stories, stories of sacrifice, dedication, and loss that often went untold because of institutional barriers or bureaucratic indifference. Her documentary about Captain Morrison was just one story among thousands, but it represented something larger about how society honors and remembers its military heroes. The confrontation with Colonel Hayes had become a symbol of the broader struggle between institutional protocols and human compassion. Major Anderson's presence added a unique dimension to the situation. As an active-duty pilot, he understood the importance of military protocols and security concerns, but he also recognized the value of preserving military history and honoring fallen comrades. His support for Rebecca's project carried significant weight because it came from someone within the military system who understood both perspectives. Colonel Hayes returned from her phone calls with a troubled expression. The conversations she'd had with her superiors had made it clear that the situation was more complicated than she had initially understood. The memorial site, while technically on military property, had been established with the explicit purpose of honoring Captain Morrison's memory, and the family's involvement in that process gave them certain rights that she couldn't simply ignore. "I've spoken with my commanding officer," Colonel Hayes announced to the group, "and we're going to review the circumstances surrounding your permit situation, Miss Martinez. In the meantime, I'm authorizing the return of your equipment, but with the understanding that any filming must be coordinated through proper channels." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it represented a step toward resolution. Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and frustration as she watched the security team begin unloading her equipment. She was grateful to have her cameras and recording devices back, but the damage to her project timeline was significant. More importantly, the confrontation had highlighted the fragile nature of her access to military stories and the constant threat of bureaucratic interference in her work. The resolution of the immediate crisis left everyone involved with complex feelings about what had transpired. Major Anderson returned to his aircraft, knowing that he had done what he could to support his fallen wingman's memory. Master Sergeant Morrison remained at the memorial, grateful that his son's story would continue to be told, but troubled by the obstacles that had been placed in its path. Colonel Hayes faced the difficult task of explaining her actions to her superiors, while maintaining her authority and credibility. For Rebecca, the confrontation had been both a setback and a revelation. She had learned that telling military stories required not just journalistic skills and technical expertise, but also the ability to navigate complex institutional politics and personal relationships. The support she had received from Major Anderson and Master Sergeant Morrison had been crucial, but it had also made her realize how dependent she was on the goodwill of others within the military community. The torn flag continued to flutter in the desert breeze, a constant reminder of the sacrifice that had brought them all together. As Rebecca set up her equipment once again, she thought about the broader implications of her experience. How many other military stories were being silenced by bureaucratic obstacles? How many families were being denied the opportunity to have their loved ones' sacrifices recognized and remembered? The documentary project had become more than just a film about Captain Morrison. It had become a statement about the importance of preserving military history and honoring the families who had paid the ultimate price for national service. Rebecca knew that she would face similar challenges in the future, but the support she had received from Major Anderson and Master Sergeant Morrison had given her the confidence to continue fighting for these stories. As she resumed filming, Rebecca reflected on the power dynamics that had played out during the confrontation. Colonel Hayes had initially used her authority to shut down the project, believing that institutional protocols took precedence over individual concerns. But the intervention of Major Anderson and Master Sergeant Morrison had demonstrated that military institutions were ultimately composed of people who cared about honoring service and sacrifice. The experience had taught Rebecca valuable lessons about the importance of building relationships within the military community and finding allies who understood and supported her work. She realized that successful military documentaries required not just technical skill and journalistic integrity, but also the ability to navigate complex social and political landscapes within military institutions. The two F-22s that had initially boxed her in were now distant specks in the sky, their pilots returning to routine training missions. But Major Anderson's decision to land and intervene had changed everything. His recognition of the torn flag and his willingness to challenge Colonel Hayes's authority had saved Rebecca's project and demonstrated the power of individual conscience within institutional structures. As Rebecca continued her work at the memorial, she thought about the broader implications of her experience for military journalism and documentary filmmaking. The confrontation had highlighted the delicate balance between security concerns and historical preservation, between institutional authority and individual rights, and between bureaucratic efficiency and human compassion. The story of Captain Morrison's final mission, symbolized by the torn flag that flew at his memorial, had become intertwined with Rebecca's own story of fighting for the right to tell that story. The documentary would now include not just the narrative of a pilot's sacrifice, but also the contemporary struggle to ensure that such sacrifices are remembered and honored despite institutional obstacles. Master Sergeant Morrison approached Rebecca as she adjusted her camera settings, his expression thoughtful. "You know, this whole situation has made me think about something Jim used to say," he told her. He always believed that the most important battles weren't necessarily the ones fought in the air, but the ones fought to preserve the values and memories that make military service meaningful. His words resonated with Rebecca, who realized that her confrontation with Colonel Hayes had indeed been a battle, one fought to preserve the right to tell military stories and honor military sacrifice. The desert sun was beginning to set as Rebecca captured the final shots of her day's filming. The torn flag, illuminated by the golden light, seemed to embody all the complex emotions and conflicts that had played out at the memorial site. It represented Captain Morrison's sacrifice, his family's grief, Major Anderson's loyalty, and Rebecca's determination to ensure that military stories continue to be told despite institutional obstacles. As she packed up her equipment, Rebecca knew that the real work was just beginning. The documentary would need to be completed, the story would need to be told, and the broader questions raised by her experience would need to be addressed. But she also knew that she had gained something valuable from the confrontation, a deeper understanding of the military community and the complex relationships that define it. The confrontation with Colonel Hayes had been resolved, but the underlying tensions between institutional authority and individual rights remained. Rebecca's experience had shown that military institutions, like all human organizations, were capable of both bureaucratic rigidity and individual compassion. The key was finding the right people, like Major Anderson and Master Sergeant Morrison, who understood the importance of preserving military history and honoring military service. Major Anderson's final approach to Rebecca before departing was filled with quiet intensity. "I want you to know that Jim Morrison would have appreciated what you're doing," he said, adjusting his flight gloves. He always believed that military service was about more than just following orders. It was about protecting the values and freedoms that make our country worth defending. Your documentary is part of that mission. His words carried the weight of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of military service. Rebecca nodded, feeling the full responsibility of the trust that had been placed in her. The torn flag that had initially attracted her attention as a visual symbol for her documentary had become something much more significant, a representation of the complex relationships between military service, institutional authority, and individual conscience. She understood now that telling Captain Morrison's story accurately would require her to include not just the facts of his final mission, but also the broader context of how military stories are preserved and honored. The desert landscape was taking on the purple hues of twilight as the last of the military vehicles departed the memorial site. Rebecca found herself alone with Master Sergeant Morrison, who had remained behind to spend a few more minutes at his son's memorial. The quiet that settled over the site was a stark contrast to the tension and conflict that had dominated the afternoon. "I come here every month," Master Sergeant Morrison told Rebecca, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "Sometimes I talk to him, sometimes I just sit and remember. Today was different, though. Today I felt like I was fighting for him again, making sure his story would be told." His words reflected the ongoing struggle that military families face in preserving the memories of their fallen loved ones. Rebecca realized that her documentary had become more than a professional project. It had become a personal mission to ensure that stories like Captain Morrison's are not lost to bureaucratic indifference or institutional obstacles. The confrontation with Colonel Hayes had been a reminder that preserving military history often requires fighting against the very institutions that such history is meant to honor. As she drove away from the memorial site, Rebecca reflected on the day's events and their broader implications. The F-22s that had initially seemed like symbols of oppression had become, through Major Anderson's intervention, symbols of the military's capacity for individual conscience and moral courage. The torn flag that flew at Captain Morrison's memorial had become a symbol not just of one man's sacrifice, but of the ongoing struggle to ensure that such sacrifices are remembered and honored. The documentary project would continue, but Rebecca knew that it would be different now. The story would include not just Captain Morrison's final mission, but also the contemporary battle to preserve military history and honor military service. The confrontation with Colonel Hayes had become part of the story, demonstrating both the obstacles that military families face and the allies they can find within the military community. Rebecca's experience had taught her that military journalism requires more than technical skills and journalistic integrity. It requires the ability to navigate complex institutional relationships and find the human connections that make military stories meaningful. The support she had received from Major Anderson and Master Sergeant Morrison had been crucial, but it had also highlighted the importance of building trust within the military community. The torn flag would continue to fly at Captain Morrison's memorial, a reminder of his sacrifice and a symbol of the ongoing struggle to preserve military history. Rebecca's documentary would ensure that his story reaches a wider audience, but it would also serve as a testament to the power of individual conscience and the importance of fighting for the right to tell military stories. As she returned to her hotel, Rebecca began planning the next phase of her project. The confrontation with Colonel Hayes had been resolved, but the broader questions it raised about military journalism and historical preservation remained. She knew that she would face similar challenges in the future, but she also knew that there were allies within the military community who shared her commitment to honoring military service and preserving military history. The documentary about Captain Morrison's final mission would be completed, and his story would be told. But Rebecca's experience had shown her that the real mission was broader than any single story. It was about ensuring that military sacrifice is remembered and honored, despite institutional obstacles and bureaucratic indifference. The torn flag that had started as a visual symbol for her documentary had become a symbol of that larger mission. Master Sergeant Morrison's final words to Rebecca before she left the memorial site had been both a challenge and a blessing. "Tell his story well," he had said, "and make sure people understand what he stood for." It was a responsibility that Rebecca accepted with full awareness of its weight and complexity. The documentary would be more than just a film. It would be a tribute to military service and a testament to the power of individual conscience within institutional structures. The F-22s that had boxed her in at the beginning of the day had become symbols of the military's capacity for both rigid authority and individual compassion. Major Anderson's decision to land and intervene had changed everything, transforming a bureaucratic confrontation into a human story about loyalty, sacrifice, and the importance of preserving military history. The torn flag would continue to fly, and Captain Morrison's story would be told. Years later, Rebecca Martinez would look back on that day in the Nevada desert as a turning point in her career and understanding of military journalism. The confrontation with Colonel Hayes had been resolved through the intervention of Major Anderson and the support of Master Sergeant Morrison. But the experience had taught her valuable lessons about the complexity of military institutions and the importance of finding allies within the military community. The documentary about Captain Morrison's final mission was completed and received critical acclaim, but more importantly, it succeeded in honoring his memory and preserving his story for future generations. The torn flag that had initially attracted Rebecca's attention as a visual symbol had become the centerpiece of a film that explored not just one man's sacrifice, but the broader themes of military service, institutional authority, and individual conscience. Major Anderson continued his service as an F-22 pilot, but he also became an advocate for preserving military history and supporting projects that honor fallen comrades. His intervention in Rebecca's situation had demonstrated the power of individual conscience within institutional structures, and he continued to use his position to support similar projects in the future. Master Sergeant Morrison found comfort in knowing that his son's story had been preserved and would continue to inspire others. The memorial site became a place of pilgrimage for military families and aviation enthusiasts, and the torn flag continued to fly as a symbol of sacrifice and dedication to service. Colonel Hayes faced questions about her handling of the situation, but she also learned valuable lessons about the importance of balancing security concerns with the need to preserve military history and honor military families. The experience led to policy changes that made it easier for legitimate documentary projects to gain access to military sites and stories. The story of the F-22s that boxed Rebecca in, only to have one pilot recognize the significance of the torn flag and intervene on behalf of justice and memory, became a symbol of the military's capacity for both rigid authority and individual compassion. It demonstrated that military institutions, like all human organizations, are ultimately composed of individuals who must balance competing demands and loyalties. Rebecca's experience taught her that military journalism requires more than technical skills and journalistic integrity. It requires the ability to navigate complex institutional relationships and find the human connections that make military stories meaningful. The support she received from Major Anderson and Master Sergeant Morrison had been crucial, but it had also highlighted the importance of building trust within the military community. The torn flag continued to fly at Captain Morrison's memorial, a reminder of his sacrifice and a symbol of the ongoing struggle to preserve military history. Rebecca's documentary ensured that his story reached a wider audience, but it also served as a testament to the power of individual conscience and the importance of fighting for the right to tell military stories. The final legacy of that day in the Nevada desert was not just a completed documentary, but a deeper understanding of the relationships between military service, institutional authority, and individual conscience. The F-22s that had initially seemed threatening had become symbols of the military's capacity for both rigid enforcement and compassionate intervention. The torn flag had become a symbol of sacrifice, memory, and the ongoing struggle to preserve military history. Rebecca Martinez's confrontation with Colonel Hayes had been resolved through the unexpected intervention of Major Anderson, who recognized the torn flag from his final mission with Captain Morrison. The incident became a case study in how military institutions can balance security concerns with the need to preserve military history and honor military families. It demonstrated that individual conscience and moral courage can triumph over bureaucratic rigidity, and that the most important battles are often fought to preserve the values and memories that make military service meaningful. The documentary about Captain Morrison's final mission stands as a testament to the power of individual determination and the importance of finding allies within institutional structures. The torn flag continues to fly at his memorial, a reminder that military sacrifice should be remembered and honored, despite institutional obstacles and bureaucratic indifference. The story of the F-22s that boxed her in, until one pilot saw the torn flag of his final mission, became a symbol of hope for military families and journalists who fight to preserve the stories that matter most.